Okay. So as we were studying First Samuel last week, we looked at how we saw rather that Saul was committing to kill David because Saul saw David as a rival to the throne. And so last week, the animosity between Saul and David was really ratcheted up. Now, when we studied that rivalry between Saul and David last week, we saw that the author of First Samuel emphasized that it was not David who was scheming to take Saul's throne. Instead, Saul's actions flowed out of his own evil and paranoid heart. And we're going to come back to this theme again this week. Again, this is one of the themes that the author of First Samuel pounds home over and over again. As a matter of fact, if you were to ask why was First Samuel written, you would have to say that in terms of its original readers, one of the reasons for First Samuel being written was to defend the Davidic kingship and to show that David's royal house was a legitimate ruler of Israel and a legitimate house to have the throne. And so that's going to be seen again tonight, even as it was seen last week. But 1 Samuel 19 tells us more about Saul's attempts to kill David. And tonight really is a lot of narrative. It's a lot of movement through the story. I don't know that there are a lot of dramatic theological points made tonight, even a lot of dramatic application or devotional points made tonight. A lot of this is just carrying the narrative along to get to the point when David will take the throne and to see how God was at work. So we're going to do a lot of description tonight, probably more than a lot of analysis. But in this chapter, we see Saul's animosity towards David getting worse and worse. And we see his attempts to murder David getting bolder and bolder. But the chapter starts by telling us that Saul's own son, Jonathan, was loyal to David and not to his father. So look at 1 Samuel 19, 1 through 3. That begins the story. It says, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. So in verse 1, Jonathan and other attendants of Saul, other members of the royal court, are told to kill David. Saul basically puts a bounty on David's head. And I imagine that the idea here is whatever member of the royal court killed David, they would receive some sort of favor and some sort of reward from Saul. So he probably is literally putting a price on David's head here in verse 1. But verse 1 tells us what we have seen already and what we already know, tells us that Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. And so Jonathan is not going to participate in this plot against David. He does not think that David has done anything to warrant his being murdered. So instead, Jonathan warns David about what is going on and about what his father is planning. And we're told here that Jonathan comes up with a plan to help David avoid this plot against him. So not only does Jonathan warn David of the plot, he also tells him how to avoid being killed. And the plot has a few parts. Jonathan tells David, one, he's to be on guard the morning of the next day. This is when the plot is going to be carried out. So since Jonathan knows the timing, he tells David to be especially careful at that time. Two, Jonathan tells David to go into hiding and to not come out for any reason. So Jonathan says, hey, David, this is a very serious situation. You will not be safe if you make yourself known. You can guarantee that someone will try to kill you. So just stay hidden until I call you out and tell you it's safe. And then three, Jonathan says, while David is in hiding, that he will discuss David's fate with his father Saul, and he will report back to David what he learns. And so that's the plan that's going to be carried out. And verses 4 through 7 in chapter 19, 1 Samuel, tell us about Jonathan's meeting with his father. It says there, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. And so Jonathan kept his word. He did exactly what he said to David. He met with Saul as promised. And in this meeting, Jonathan was very courageous and he advocated for his friend, whom Saul saw as a rival to the throne. And so, how did Saul advocate for David? What was the case that he made here? Well, we're told in these verses in the words that Jonathan speaks. One, Jonathan pointed out that David was sacrificial. He pointed out that David was willing to risk his own life for the good of his country and for the good of Saul's kingdom, right? In verse 5, Jonathan says very plainly, he took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Philistine, of course, is Goliath. And it's no exaggeration to say David was taking his life in his hands, fighting this man who was over 9 feet tall and was very strong. And so Jonathan says, hey, Dad, David's been very sacrificial. He has risked his own life for the good of your throne and for the good of your kingdom. Jonathan also pointed out that God was at work through David, right? Second half of verse 5, Jonathan says to Saul, the Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Of course, again, that's referring to David and Goliath, and we all know who the Lord won the victory through. The Lord won the victory through David. And that gave Saul great joy when this giant of a Philistine was defeated and when the Philistine army was routed. And so Jonathan says, why would you put to death someone whom God is working through to rescue and deliver your kingdom? Then Jonathan also points out that David had delighted Saul in the past, right? Because he says, the Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. And so Saul had found great joy in the work that David had done. But Jonathan also probably could have talked about the joy that Saul found when David played the lyre and the way that that calmed the spiritual turmoil that was happening as demons oppressed Saul. And so Saul points out how good David had been to Saul. Excuse me, Jonathan points out how good David had been to Saul. And finally, Jonathan pointed out that David was an innocent man, right? The end of verse 5. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? And so he says, look, what has David done to you? David has served you. David has been humble before you. David has not plotted against you. There's not a single charge that you can bring against David. So why would you put him to death? And so Jonathan makes a very short but very eloquent case for his friend and defends David very admirably before his father. And so we are told that Saul listened to Jonathan. He agreed with what Jonathan said, and then Saul took a vow not to kill David. That vow is very central. You got to remember this for what comes up in the rest of the story. Verse 6 says, Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath, call it a vow too. He says, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So not only did Saul make a promise, but he made a promise invoking the name of the Lord. He took an oath in the Lord's name. This is a very, very serious matter. And so, in light of what's going to happen in the coming chapters, we have to remember this, or when we see what's going to happen in the coming chapters, we have to remember this oath that Saul made in the Lord's name. And again, you're seeing that apologetic purpose here. The author of Samuel wants you to know that any wrongs were committed by Saul, not David, because Saul had made a vow in the Lord's name that he was not going to attack or harm David. And we're going to see it doesn't take very long for Saul to attempt to break that vow that he has made. And so right here, though, in this moment in verse 7, Saul reconciles with David. Jonathan calls David. He tells him the whole thing that his father said. He brings David to Saul, and now David is with Saul as before. He continues to play the lyre, and he continues to fight for Saul. Look at 1 Samuel 19:8. It says, once more war broke out, and David, or let's just say, once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. So for a while, they are back together, but verses 9 through 10 reveal that Saul's hostility against David soon resurrected itself. Again, 1 Samuel 19, 9 through 10. It says, "But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape." And so in these verses, we see Saul up to his old tricks. David is back playing the lyre, trying to smooth out Saul's spirit, give him peace and calm when he's having a demonic attack. But the lyre does not work to soothe Saul in this occasion. It is not enough. And so I would argue that it's under the influence of this demon that Saul tried to kill David with a spear. The spear misses David and it is driven into a wall. And so you know the spear was thrown with murderous force as Saul is able to drive this thing into a wall. There can be no doubt what his intention was. He's trying to kill David. So we're only what, 2 verses away, 3 verses away from when Saul made his vow before the Lord that he would not harm David. And already the vow is being broken. And so this is the point where David knows that he must escape for good. He starts to know that this relationship is not going to be repaired. And so verses 11 through 17 tell us how David makes his escape. 1 Samuel 19, 11 through 17. It says, Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, he is ill. Then Saul sent the men back to David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Michal told him, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? And so here we learn that Jonathan was not the only child of Saul willing to betray him to help David. Saul did not have a family that was all that loyal to him, and that probably tells you something about Saul's character. It was only Jonathan, it was also Saul's daughter Michal who helped David escape. And so we're told about how the plot goes here after David is nearly speared. After that spear is driven into the wall, David flees back to his house. When he gets to the house, Michal warns David that he is going to be killed tomorrow morning. So once again, there's a plot where he's going to be murdered at dawn. Here, Michal is warning David exactly like her brother did. You can see the comparison between the two of them because they're both warning David about a plot that will take place in the morning of the next day. Now, David fears that people are watching the house. So he fears that he's not going to be able to escape because his escape will be noticed. And so we're told that rather than going out the front door, or maybe rather than going out the back door, the side door, rather than doing that, David is lowered from an upper home window so that people won't notice that he's getting away. Reminds me a little bit of Saul in the city of Damascus in the New Testament. Now, Mike, or the spies actually in Jericho as well. Now, Michal tries to delay any pursuit of David by making it appear that he is in bed under the covers, right? We're told that when the men come to collect David and bring him to Saul, Michal stalls by saying David is ill. And she sort of fakes that there's a guy in bed by putting an idol that she has in the household. She puts that under the sheets and the pillow. She puts a little goat hair on the idol. And, the guys from Saul come and they think that David is really ill. It sort of makes you wonder, what did David's hair look like? Like, did David have hair that could be compared to a goat? And was maybe that a compliment in the ancient Near East? I have no idea. I don't know if this is a comment on David's hair, or if it's a comment of the intelligence of those that Saul sent to go bring David to him to be murdered. And this is another point, I think, in the Bible where you definitely see that God has a sense of humor, right? Because these guys come to grab David so that Saul can kill him. And Michael says, well, David can't go with you. He's sick, right? And so these guys go back to Saul and say to Saul, well, we couldn't bring David to be killed because he's sick, right? And I could just sort of see Saul like doing a face palm. Like these are sort of like the cartoon henchmen, like, well, if he's sick, what difference does that make when I'm going to kill him? Bring him here. It will be easier to do the job. I think there's probably a little bit of humorous incompetence here. Um, and so Saul sends the guys back. And when they come back for David, they discern Michael's deception. Sorry for the misspelling there. They discern Michael's deception and they know that David has gotten away. And so, presumably, instead of bringing David back to Saul, they bring Michael back to Saul because in verse 17, Saul speaks to Michael and he says to her, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? So you can see that Saul is very angry at what has happened. He demands to know why his daughter has helped David. But Michael, interestingly, lies to Saul. She doesn't do what Jonathan did. She doesn't have the same courage. She doesn't say, well, David's an innocent man. He served you well. He's brought you joy. There's no reason for you to put him to death. No, Michael is afraid. And so Michael says that David threatened to kill her if she did not take part in this deception, right? At the end of verse 17, Michael says, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? That did not actually happen. We know that. Michael is lying and saying that David threatened to kill her if she did not participate in the plot and do what she said. And so Michael is not the person that her brother Jonathan is. One, she apparently worships idols because she has an idol in the house. That she laid in the bed. It's interesting that apparently David had idols in his house, but the idea seems to be that the idols belonged to Michael, not to David. He was not participating in the worship of them. And then, of course, Michael lies, unlike Jonathan, who seems to always have a compulsion to tell the truth. Because you remember in a similar situation when Jonathan's life was threatened, when he had eaten the honey when Saul said nobody was to eat until the battle was over. You remember Saul threatened his life. You remember Jonathan quickly owned up to what he had done. And he said, you made a foolish decision. You should have let everybody eat, but basically go ahead and kill me because I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do. And then, of course, the troops protected Jonathan's life. But you see the difference between Jonathan and Michael. They do not come from the same moral stock, even if they come from the same family. And so verses 18 through 24 describe what happened after David fled. And this is a rather bizarre story, probably one of the more bizarre stories in all of the Bible. Probably definitely a story we could have put in our PG-13 Bible story series that we did, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. I can't remember when it was, but since I've been back. 1 Samuel 19, 18 through 24 says, when David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Word came to Saul, David is in Naioth at Ramah. So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it and he sent more men and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Seku. And he asked, where are Samuel and David? Over in Naioth at Ramah, they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. This is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets? And so what happens after David is let down from the window and escapes? We know what happens on Michael's end. We've seen that already. What happens now on David's end? Well, one, David flees to Ramah where Samuel is, because obviously he knows Samuel is a great man of God, and he trusts Samuel to have wisdom and prophetic insight to help him to know what to do. Plus, Samuel is the one who anointed him as king, right? And so he needs to go to Samuel for that a confirmation of all these things. Now, remember, Samuel and Saul had not had contact with one another. We were told that Samuel had departed from Saul and that basically he would not see him again. And so Samuel seems not to have full knowledge of all that has gone on between David and Saul. And so David tells Samuel everything that Saul had done to him. That's in the middle of verse 19. And so Saul realizes that David's life is greatly at risk. He realizes that David is very likely to be killed. And so Samuel and David flee to Naioth, and likely that is to hide from Saul. Samuel is trying to keep David under wraps so that he cannot be hurt or injured. After all, he knows that he is the next king by God's word. And so Saul is told that Samuel and David are in Naioth. Somehow somebody spies it out and intelligence comes back to him. And so Saul sends some of his army to capture David. That's in verse 20. We're just told that he sent men to capture him. But then an odd thing happens to this group of soldiers. They don't get into a fight, but they do run into a group of prophets prophesying. Samuel is the leader of this group. They are perhaps speaking in tongues or maybe just speaking in Hebrew in the Israelite language, messages of prophecy. And as the soldiers listen to Samuel and the prophets prophesy, the soldiers also start to prophesy. They also fall under the control of the Spirit. And because they are under the control of the Spirit, they cannot complete their mission. And so Saul hears that his men have failed in their mission. He realizes they don't come back in the time they should have come back. And so Saul sends another group of soldiers. And the same thing happens to the second group that happened to the first. They get controlled by the power of the Holy Spirit as they hear these prophets prophesying. And so Saul sends a third group of soldiers. And the same thing happens to them. They also come under the control of the Spirit as they hear the prophets prophesying. And so, having seen his troops fail 3 times, Saul now decides to go and to do the job himself. He journeys to Ramah. And then when he comes to a certain well, he asks where David and Samuel are. Now, you might say, why did he do that? He already knew where they were. He had been told where they were, but maybe he thinks after all that has happened, they move on. He's just trying to confirm the intelligence that he's had. And so it should say Saul goes to Naioth, and there Saul prophesies like his men. The same thing that happened to his men happens to him also. And Saul prophesies the whole way to Samuel. So this time, presumably, um, he doesn't really run into the prophets. Even before Saul gets to the prophets, the Spirit of God comes on him and he begins to prophesy. And then we're told when he finally arrives at Saul, he takes all his clothes off, he strips naked at Samuel's feet, and he continues prophesying. And so people wonder once again, is Saul a prophet? At the end of verse 24, we're told this is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets? Is he not just a king? Is he a prophet like Samuel? Now, it is important to note this is not the first time that people have wondered if Saul was a prophet. You might remember that back in chapter 10, this question was also asked. If you look back at chapter 10 and verses 9 through 13, it said, as Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart. And all these signs were fulfilled that day. When he and his servant arrived to Gibeah, a procession of prophets met him. The Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he joined in their prophesying. When all those who had formerly known him saw him prophesying with the prophets, they asked each other, what is this that has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? A man who lived there answered, and who is their father? So it became a saying, is Saul also among the prophets? After Saul stopped prophesying, he went to the high place. Now, in chapter 10, Saul was filled with the Spirit as a sign that he was God's appointed king. It was a confirmation of what Samuel had just told Saul, that he was going to become king. Now, though, it's literally a 180, because now it's just saying chapter 19, sorry for that typo, chapter 19, Saul is filled with the Spirit because he has been rejected as king, and the future King David needs to be protected. Another key difference between the two accounts, the one in chapter 10, the one in chapter 19, is that Saul strips naked here in this chapter. So he is exposed and humiliated in this latter account. And so in chapter 10, when people asked about Saul being among the prophets, that may have been an admiring question. Does Saul have the wisdom to be among the prophets? Now it might be a mocking question. Is he a fool walking around naked like some of the prophets do? It may be that the tenor and the tone of the question have changed. And so that's why we're told about this second instance of this saying. So, what do we learn from this chapter here, chapter 19? What lessons do we draw from it? Again, it's a lot of narrative. There may not be a lot of deep insight here, but I do think there's some things that we can learn about our own walk with Jesus from this chapter. First thing we learn is that God protects and vindicates those who have faith in him, right? We see here how the Lord protected David. He made the spear that was thrown with great force miss. When troops and armies came against David and Samuel, an old man, the power of the Holy Spirit stopped those soldiers from carrying out their mission. You could even say the Lord gave Jonathan and Michael wisdom to intervene and to protect David. Providentially, God interacts or God oversees David and just intervenes in this situation to protect him. Now, this does not mean that the righteous do not have to suffer. I think we have to imagine that David suffered here greatly because of all that he went through. Being on the run, having to be away from your home, living in fear you're going to be killed, those are all difficult things. So God is not saying that we will never suffer, but God is saying that we are not forgotten in our suffering and that we will be shielded and protected. And of course, and you say, well, does that mean there are no martyrs in this lifetime? Does that mean we never have to give our lives for the sake of the Lord? No, of course not. But even if our life is taken from us, we are not harmed. Why? Because we have an eternity to live with God forever, free from pain and sorrow and sickness and all of those things. We will be in the new heavens and the new earth forever, living there with God. And so we are protected by the Lord. And we see some ways that God protects the righteous here. He does it through empathetic people. We mentioned Jonathan and Michael already, who intervened for David. He does it through divine providence, through working out events like a spear missing its mark so that David could survive. He does it through the movement of the Holy Spirit, and I would add through the power of the Word of God. As we saw the Spirit come upon the prophets and then go to these soldiers, the Spirit even worked among those who did not fear God or did not honor him. And so, in the end, God does not abandon his people. He has many ways to deliver us. And the second thing that we learn from this chapter, the second important lesson, is that God's purposes in history do not fail. God has said that David will be king. No matter how much opposition comes against David and comes against God, David is going to be king. He is going to be in the position that God has appointed him for him to be in. God's purposes in history do not fail. And maybe that's an important reminder for us as we process the outcome of the election. Some people are happy about the election. Some people are not happy about the election tonight. Some people are anxious about what happened. But remember that God's purposes in history do not fail. And so God has a purpose for everything that happens in history. And even if you think something might be bad right now, God might be using that to ultimately bring good or to ultimately achieve his purpose. And so we see that here. Saul was a powerful guy. He had every sort of military asset at his beck and call, and he still is not able to get David because God's purposes in history do not fail. David was meant to be king. God had said he would be king. God says it. I believe it. That settles it. David is going to be king. And so we see that lesson again here. And so chapter 20 continues the story of Saul hunting David. He is not done yet. And so in 21 through 2, verses 1 through 2, David flees from his hiding spot to seek out Jonathan. And so look at 1 Samuel 21 through 2. It says, Then David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me? Never, Jonathan replied. You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything great or small without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so. In verse 1, David comes to Jonathan and asks why Saul is trying to kill him. David wants to know, have I done some wrong that I am not aware of? Is there something that I messed up on that's never been brought to my attention? Now, Jonathan is made incredulous by David's accusations against Saul. Jonathan doesn't believe what David is saying to him. Remember what we saw just last chapter. Saul had promised Jonathan that he would not murder David. Jonathan felt very confident in that promise. And Jonathan felt that he was in his father's inner circle, that Saul would tell him anything and everything that he was going to do. And so John initially reacts badly to these accusations that David brings. He doesn't like what David is saying about his father. Jonathan feels that David is either lying or most likely that he is mistaken. Now, David's accusations against Saul, though, don't erase Jonathan's loyalty to David. Jonathan is still committed to David, even with what he thinks are these false charges against his father. So look at 1 Samuel 20, verses 3 through 4. It says, But David took an oath and said, Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes. And he has said to himself, Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only a step between me and death. Jonathan said to David, Whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you. And so David responds to Jonathan's defense of his father by taking an oath. This is the second time in 2 chapters we've been told that somebody takes an oath. David's taking of an oath is meant to be a not so subtle reminder of that oath that Saul took last chapter. And so David is taking an oath and speaking the truth. And it's a reminder that Saul took an oath and he didn't speak the truth. And so David wants to assure Jonathan that he knows what he is talking about. And David comes up with an explanation for why Saul wouldn't have told Jonathan about his plans, right? Saul knows that Jonathan is loyal to David, and he knows that Jonathan is going to tell David of Saul's intentions. That has happened already. And so Saul keeps Jonathan in the dark because he really wants David dead. Now, Jonathan accepts David's explanation. He sees that his dad is keeping him in the dark. And so he once again agrees to help David find out Saul's true intentions. Jonathan promises David he'll get to the bottom of this. He will find out if his father really wants David dead. And so verses 5 through 9 outline the plan that David has to reveal Saul's true intentions towards him. Says, So David said, Look, tomorrow is the new moon feast, and I am supposed to dine with the king. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him, David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan. If he says, Very well, then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure that he is determined to harm me. As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father? Never, Jonathan said. If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you? Now, the narrative is not necessarily the smoothest here. I've told you before, and I've pointed out other places in 1 Samuel where the narrative is not really all that smooth. And the reason I'm saying the narrative is not smooth is this. The last time that we saw David, he was in hiding with Samuel, avoiding Saul's wrath. Now David sort of comes out of hiding, presumably to seek out Jonathan to tell him what's going on. But David also says that he's expected to attend the new moon feast at Saul's house. Now that seems a little odd, right? David is in hiding because he knows Saul is going to kill him, but he also knows that Saul has the expectation that he will show up at the house for this new moon dinner. And he knows that if he doesn't show up, Saul's going to wonder where he is. And so we would ask, well, why would Saul wonder where he is? He knows David is hiding because he wants to kill him, right? I mean, the narrative here is a little rocky. So am I saying it's contradictory? Of course, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the author Samuel drew his narrative by divine inspiration from many human sources, and they were telling different stories, or telling the same story, excuse me, in slightly different ways. And so there's not contradiction here, but the author Samuel just didn't think it worth the time to smooth out the accounts and to make them flow. And so I think there are details that could easily take us from David being in hiding to David showing up at the new moon feast. We're just not told what those details are. They weren't in the sources that the author of First Samuel used, or the author of First Samuel knew them, and he just didn't feel like, including them. And so we're just not clear about how exactly all this flowed. But again, there's nothing here to me that is like contradictory. There's nothing here that couldn't be explained in the number of plausible ways. We just don't know what those ways are. Now, in case you're wondering about this new moon feast and what a new moon feast was, a new moon feast was offered in conjunction with sacrifices that were prescribed by the Old Testament law. And so Numbers 28 mandated that Israel offer sacrifices at the start of each month. And to understand this, you have to remember that Israel followed a lunar calendar. We follow a solar calendar, a calendar based on the sun. Israel in the ancient times followed a calendar that was based on the moon. And so Numbers 28 talked about a lunar calendar and how it should be observed. Numbers 28, 11 through 15, we read these words. On the first of every month, present to the Lord a burnt offering of 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs a year old, all without defect. With each bull, there is to be a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil. Ephah is a unit of measurement. With the ram, a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil. And with each lamb, a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil. This is for a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma, a food offering presented to the Lord. Which eat with each bull there is to be a drink offering of half a hin of wine, another unit of measurement, with the ram a third of a hin, and with each lamb a quarter of a hin. This is the monthly burnt offering to be made at each new moon. So there you see that idea of the new moon during the year. Besides the regular burnt offering with its drink offering, 1 male goat is to be presented to the Lord as a sin offering. And so the new moon offering was meant to dedicate each month to the Lord. It was offered at the beginning of each month. And by the time of David, the offering was apparently being accompanied by a celebratory feast. And the offering may have been treated as a fellowship offering. That may be why there was feasting involved. Because remember, a fellowship offering could be eaten by the worshiper. It wasn't just that there were parts reserved for the priest and for God. What was left over could be eaten by the worshipers. That was unusual among the offerings. So that's what that new moon offering is all about. It's an offering that Israel offered at the start of each month, and they accompanied with a feast. And so David knew that his lack of attendance at the new moon feast would be noticed, and this was especially true as Saul was truly wanting to kill him. And so, knowing that Jonathan and David were close, Saul would ask Jonathan where David was. And Jonathan was to say that David was in Bethlehem making a sacrifice for his whole clan. It wasn't really good form to skip out on a dinner that was held by the king. If you were, in the king's court and the king said there's going to be a big feast and a celebratory dinner, not attending was not a politically wise thing to do. But in this case, David offers what would have been considered a legitimate excuse. The new moon sacrifice was sort of a monthly thing. Next month there would be another one. But David here was talking about an annual feast, one that involved his whole family. And so this annual family event would have probably outranked this monthly new moon celebration, not only in David and Saul's mind, but in the mind of that ancient culture. And so David's making up a good reason why he did not show up to the new moon banquet. And so David says that Saul's reaction that David's absence would reveal his true intentions. So if Saul accepted David's absence, if he said no big deal, okay, great, you went with his family, that's okay with me, then we would know that Saul had no ill intent toward David. But if Saul got angry at David's absence, then it would be clear that Saul wanted to kill David, and Saul was angry because another chance to murder his rival had gone begging. So this is sort of like laying the fleece before the Lord. I don't know. When actually was reading through this, I was thinking of like, Paul Revere, how they told him if the British were coming or not, like by one light or two light or whatever it was in the steeple. It's the same thing. There's two reactions. It'll tell you whether it's time to run or time to come back, right? And so Saul's reaction is going to be the fleece. It's going to be a thing that reveals his intention towards David. And Jonathan agrees to carry out this plan, even as he protests his father's innocence. Jonathan is sure that his dad has no ill intent toward David. He is sure that his dad is going to honor his oath. He's sure that Saul would tell he sort of thought Saul would tell him if he was going to do any harm towards David. And so, even though it's a little earlier than we normally wrap up, we're going to wrap up there. We're going to have to wait till next week to see what happens. I'm sure many of you know the outcome already, or even if you've never read the story before, you can probably guess what the outcome is going to be. But we're going to pick it up because we go forward. We're not going to be able to get through everything we need to get through to make it cohesive. So I think this is our best stopping point to come back next week, Lord willing. So are there any comments or questions about anything we studied tonight? Again, I know this was not the most devotional, not the most theological. Applications were probably a little minimal tonight. It was just much more explanatory and moving the narrative along. And we're probably going to have a bit of that going forward. Now, I will say next week there is a great theological point that comes out of this whole story, but we're not going to get to that point until we get to the end of chapter 20. We have to see how the whole story plays out. So there is a very relevant point here for our Christian life and for our walk with Jesus. We just didn't get to it tonight. So same bat time, same bat channel next week, and we'll get to the end of the story and we'll see what important lesson this story has for us as disciples of Jesus. Because again, very often in these stories, I'll foreshadow, very often in these stories, it's important to see David as a type of Christ. Now, of course, David is not always a type of Christ. Like when he sins with Bathsheba, then he's not a type of Christ. But I think a lot of the story opens up when we see David as a type or representative of Christ, because after all, Christ is the one who comes from the royal line. So we'll get to that application next week. So thanks for hanging in there this week. I know a little bit not as much application maybe as we normally make, but God willing, next week we'll get back to some really good application and be able to talk about that. So any questions or comments before you do that? Let me just stop the recording.